Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Brother Conyers, for that welcome and introduction. I am the president of the Theta Lambda chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, seated in Arlington and Alexandria, Virginia. And as Brother Conyers mentioned, that Voteless People is a Hopeless People is one of our main national programs. It's a program that is of critical importance to our fraternity and our chapter. I want to thank Brother Conyers and Brother Griffin, who are the co-chairs of our Voteless People is a Hopeless People Committee for their work on this. And I'd like to thank the NAACP as well for partnering with us on this event. I'll just take a few minutes to let you, give you a little bit of brief background about our chapter. Theta Rho Lambda was the first satellite chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated that was founded in the Washington, D.C. area. We were chartered on December 30th, 1964. Our charter was expanded to include Alexandria, Virginia as well in 2015. We are a chapter of a growing chapter of men of diverse fields and accomplishments, and we apply our talents to our communities as much as we can. So we thank you again for joining us. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Brother Conyers.
Great, thank you, Brother Lang. So now I'd like to introduce our moderator for the evening, Brother DeGeorge Griffin.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Brother DeGeorge Griffin. I serve as a co-chair of Voteless People is a Hopeless People here for Theta Rho Lambda. And I have the pleasure of presenting our distinguished guests who will each introduce themselves. So let's get started with the Honorable Traci Deshazor.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for having me. I am Traci Deshazor. Previously, I served as the Deputy Secretary of the Commonwealth of Virginia, first appointed by Governor Terry McAuliffe and then reappointed by Governor Ralph Northam. In that capacity, I oversaw about 8 or so different divisions overseeing the governor's clemency efforts. And so it's pardons and restoration of civil rights efforts. In addition to that, I helped oversee all of the governor's gubernatorial appointments. And so approximately 900 per year, about 4,000 or so during the course of a governor's administration. And then also oversaw the reimagining of the governor's Office of Constituent Services and Community Engagement. Currently, professionally, I serve as the first ever Chief Equity Officer for the city of Richmond. In addition to that, very active in my sorority, Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, where I am one of the state social action and connection coordinators.
Thank you so much, Traci. And of course, that first fam love. So awesome. With that, we'll also like to ask Mr. Michael Hemminger, the president of the Arlington NAACP, to introduce himself as well.
Thank you so much, and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having this important panel tonight. My name is Mike Hemminger. I'm the president of the NAACP Arlington branch. We're one of the most active branches in the entire country. And if you're not familiar with NAACP, we're the oldest, largest, and the boldest civil rights organization in America. I'm also the first Black deputy chair for the Democrat Party here. And I also serve on the 8th Congressional District Committee, and looking forward to tonight's conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. We're super excited to have you here. We're super excited for our continued partnership as well. So our theme this evening is on why Virginia local elections matter. So with that, I would like to ask each of our panelists to answer the first question, which is based on what is the impact do local elections, or essentially what impact do local elections have on our daily lives, and why are they important? Traci, did you want to start with that?
Sure, I'm happy to, and I really appreciate that question, right? I think it goes to the saying, and I'm sure Michael will agree, right? All politics is local, all right? And you all have probably heard that, but literally, if you look around you, everything is political. Someone made a decision somewhere, right? If you look at where schools are located, right? A decision had to be made. Well, who gets to make that decision? How is it determined, right? If you look at where there are traffic lights, right? You look at where there are speed bumps and speed tables. All of those decisions are made at a local level. And so everything is, all politics is local. right? And everything around you is political. And so I would argue that our local elections are some of our most important elections for that very reason. And so if there's something that you're concerned about, starting at that local level and really developing and building those relationships with those local leaders are critically important. One thing I'll also say is just to qualify when we say local politics, what is it that we're referring to, right? And so we're talking about our boards of supervisors, right? Our city councils and town councils. That's what we mean when we say local government. So our mayor, and considering who's serving at that level, our school boards, oftentimes, depending on where you are, perhaps your sheriff, right? Also a locally elected official. And so, but again, all politics is local.
That was an awesome answer. Thank you so much for that. President Hemminger.
Thank you. I don't have much more to add. That was exactly how I was going to lead. All politics is local. Where we park our school buses matters. Where our highways are in our county, it matters. Some of the disparities that exist even today are well known and well researched in our local community, and who we elect, it matters. I'll give you an example. In Arlington, we're the smallest geographic county in the entire country, but there's a 10-year life expectancy difference depending on where you live. So if you live on one part of the county, you get to live 10 years longer. And if you live on the other part of the county where all the Black and brown folks are, then your likelihood of living is going to be 10 years less, statistically proven. And just going back to what my colleague Traci mentioned, who we elect matters, and our local elections are some of the most important things. I think about, the achievement gap in our schools. The achievement gap is greater today than it was in the height of integration. Our schools are more segregated today than they were, again, in the height of integration. These are all well-known facts, right? And so who we elect matters. We need leaders that have the courage to be able to make a difference for all of their constituents and not just some of them.
That was really insightful. And I definitely agree that we need leaders that have courage. Thank you so much for that as well. Traci, I would love to continue the conversation with our next question on what role do local officials play in shaping policies that affect economic development, meaning education, housing, healthcare, and any other critical areas, particularly from a policy perspective?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. And I love how you're asking it and framing it, right? And so I'm going to try to hit on the interconnectivity of it, right? And so you make the decision, and then what are the implications of that policy decision? So I'll use a very specific example for the city of Richmond. And so in the city of Richmond, there is an abundance of parking spaces. I mean, they're everywhere. There are a number of parking, garages, but what we found is that those parking spaces, those parking garages are not necessarily accessible. They are not necessarily where people are living, working, playing, right? And so that's a challenge. So you have all of this parking, but no one can actually access it. And then nationwide, right, we have a housing crisis. Right? We do not have enough homes for people. We look at just how that particular challenge of not actually having enough homes, affordable homes, is also connected to homelessness, right? And so we have a number of people that are unhoused, with even more as we've come through this pandemic of COVID-19. And so recently in the city of Richmond, a decision was made to forego, right, or not require parking minimums for future economic development deals for the city. So what that means now is that as a company is interested in an opportunity in the city, they are no longer required to build in a certain number of parking spaces. Now you would go, well, wait a minute, whoa. Well, what does that mean if it's an amphitheater or something that's going to draw big crowds, or for concerts or something like that? Well, remember what I said, that what we found is that oftentimes people are actually interested in public transportation, and that we actually have, I believe on average, I believe it's somewhere around 7 parking spaces for every one vehicle, every one person driving a vehicle. That was actually recently, I cited, I believe, in NPR just earlier today or yesterday. And so we know that we have enough parking. We know that we have a public transportation infrastructure that will get people where they need to go. But I think that's a very specific example of a very specific policy decision that was made, and then the ultimate implications. Now that frees up space for us to reimagine where that parking was. Perhaps instead of having these hard surfaces, we're able to incorporate more green space, right? So helping to actually bring down and mitigate some of the challenges that we're seeing as a direct result of climate change as well with the heat. And so it's all interconnected.
Yeah, definitely. And accessibility and particularly climate change and sustainability are all areas that are super important. And thank you for your leadership there and also for that fantastic response as well. Michael, how can we ensure that all eligible voters are able to participate in local elections? And what can be done to increase voter turnout, which is roughly only 25% in local elections right now?
Yeah, that's a really awesome question. I think, I'd like to start by just acknowledging that many people before us have fought and died for us to have the right to vote. We will get told over and over again that your vote doesn't matter, and they want you to believe that your vote doesn't matter. But when you are in that voting booth, you have the same amount of power that Elon Musk does, or some of our billionaires and millionaires. And at no other time do you have the same amount of power as some of these really influential people. So I want to take a moment to lift that up first. Virginia actually went from being one of the worst states in the country when it came to voting rights to being one of the best. If you live in Virginia, just know that we have elections every single year. You don't have to remember if we have an election this year, because we do. Every year in Virginia, we have elections. Recently, we expanded early voting. You can now vote up to 45 days before the election starts. We were one of the only countries in the world that has our elections on a work day in the middle of the day. Many other countries, it's a holiday. It happens on a Saturday. But now we're overcoming that by allowing folks to have 45 extra days in order to vote. So you no longer need to go and vote on election day. You can vote 45 days early. In fact, there are elections underway even now in your local communities. The other thing is you can become a permanent absentee voter. We know historically in the Black and brown community, a lot of us are working 2, 3, 4 jobs. We live in multi-generational housing, and time really is money. And so you can become a permanent absentee voter as well. The last thing that you can do is, make sure that you're doing your part in honoring the legacy of, some of our ancestors that have fought so hard for this, but also just, making sure that your own network is voting, your friends, your family, your neighbors, people on your social media, even just a quick reminder of what's at stake can encourage people to vote.
Definitely. And I love that part about everyone has power. You have as much power as a billionaire when you vote. That was extremely insightful. And thank you so much for also letting folks know here in Virginia, we have elections every year as well. So thank you for that as well. And thank you for that fantastic response. Back to you, Traci. What are some of the challenges facing local governments, and how can these be addressed through effective leadership as well?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I'm going to start with, and I'm going to answer it in a couple of different ways. I'm going to start with a very practical response. I think one of the greatest challenges faced by local government, I think it's actually attracting talent. Right? I think that we have seen a disruption in how comprehensive and accurate history is taught in this country. We've seen a disruption with how civics education is taught, right? And I think that there's a certain perception of government now, and certainly one, when you look at younger generations, right, there's just a perception of it. And it's not necessarily a space that I would say a lot of young people are eager to get into. I think that they have found ways to elevate their voice that don't necessarily look like being a part of the system that is government, right? And there's certainly space at the table for all of those different ways in which we elevate our voices. So I think that's a very practical challenge, is just recruiting talent, and especially young talent, Certainly something that's seen at the state level. When I was still in state government, we actually had a significant challenge with this. We were attracting some talent, but not nearly enough. I believe that it was something around 1 in 4 or 5 state government employees would be eligible for retirement within about a 10-year time period. So we were active in creating fellowship programs to create pathways for recent graduates, emerging professionals to actually enter to government and stay. Right, and actually stay. I think a few very serious issues that local governments are facing right now. I'm going to come back to housing.
Yeah.
I mean, we truly have a crisis in this country when it comes to housing, when it comes to pathways for home ownership, when it comes to just affordable housing for individuals that are interested in remaining as renters. We have a challenge. We don't have enough multi-generational housing. It is a true challenge that we're facing. And then the second big challenge I think local governments are facing is modernization. And that is being able to keep up with technology at the speed at which it's moving, right? We see advancements in AI every day. I think there's another article about a new platform that's leveraging AI. Government has yet to catch up to that. And we're going to get left behind if we don't pick up the pace.
Yeah, thank you so much for talking about that, particularly in bridging the gap, and then also mentioning in terms of like the technology, in terms of like Gen AI is huge right now, and it's something that, from a government perspective, that we need to stay ahead of as well. Thank you so much for that fantastic and insightful answer as well. Michael, what are some of the key issues that are often decided at the local level, and how do these decisions affect our communities? E.g., for example, public safety, local school boards, proposed developments. What are some of those key local issues? And again, what's that impact and effect on our communities?
Yeah, really deep question. And the short answer is, excuse me, everything. All the stuff seen and unseen is affected at the local level. I love that housing has become a central theme of what we're talking about tonight. I'll give you an example of how we do housing in Arlington. I want to encourage you to try to figure out how you do housing in your city or county. For about a decade and a half, we've allowed developers to come into our community to build these properties. I'm a housing commissioner here in Arlington as well. We'll allow these developers to come in and build 1,000, 1,200, 1,500 units on a single property. And we won't put a single committed affordable unit anywhere near this property. Instead, this developer ends up putting the small amount of money into what we call the Affordable Housing Investment Fund. And we end up concentrating poverty, where we have 100% of people living in poverty that are going to the same schools, that are experiencing and trying to overcome the same systemic issues. And it's modern day redlining. And so when you say, hey, what matters at the local level? Everything matters. I go back to the achievement gap in our schools. Education is the great equalizer. And if we're not giving all of our kids the same fresh start or the same starting foundation, then from education on, we're already setting them up for failure. I think about criminal justice. In Arlington, we were the last local jurisdiction in the capital region to get body-worn cameras for our police officers in 2023. Take a moment to think about that. We just stood up a community oversight board, and it's because of the leaders that we elected at the local level. And so all politics is local. The leaders that we elect matter. We have to have leaders that reflect the lived experience of the community.
Wow. I actually would love to ask a follow-up question there, particularly based off of, you mentioned something really important here in Arlington, which is those body cameras. Can you expand upon that and particularly understand that just happened this year? Wow.
Yeah. Absolutely. So in Arlington, the Black population is 9%. We used to be 40% of Arlington. We're now 9%. But when we look at the arrest data, over 70% of the people arrested in Arlington are Black. Over 75% of the people in our jail today or any given day are Black. But our population is 9%. And so there are forces that you cannot see. There are structural, institutional, and systemic issues that are causing Black folks to get locked up and arrested and have adverse interactions with police officers at significantly higher rates than their counterparts. And when we look at, complaints, I can tell you firsthand as the president of the NAACP, not a single day goes by where I'm not getting a phone call, I'm not getting an email, I'm not getting photos, of something happening in our community. And so for the first time ever, we have body-worn cameras, and we have the community oversight board. And so with those two tools on our tool belt, hopefully we can start to change some of those systemic issues and hold folks accountable where they need to be held accountable.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for all that you're doing, and particularly for the NAACP's leadership on that as well. That's impressive. In terms of moving along, Traci, I want to kind of then go on to back to local elections. So how do you feel that local elections help to promote accountability and transparency in government? And what can be done to ensure that local officials are creating policies that have a positive impact? So how can people get involved in like advocacy work potentially as well?
Yeah, it's that's a really great question. These are really good questions. And so thank you. I'm gonna start with the latter, and I'm going to use a very specific, I think, policy initiative, and one that I hope to see really, implemented at a federal level. Arlington has an initiative. Alexandria, Fairfax County is standing up one, City of Richmond, and I think also Charlottesville is in the works, and that's guaranteed income. Right. And so we're seeing this, and just to give you some context and history, right? So it's something that a universal basic income is something that Dr. King, Brother King, right, actually outlined in Chaos Community, right? And so it's his last written work, and just talking about where do we go from here. That concept was then really picked up and mobilized by a leader, Johnny Tillman, and it's something that has been discussed for decades, but really starting to build some momentum recently. And so former mayor of Stockton, California, Michael Tubbs, the youngest mayor elected out there in Stockton, one of the youngest mayors ever elected in the country, he was attending Stanford University. While there, he learned about guaranteed income. Then once he became mayor, he actually launched a pilot in the city of Stockton. And then from there, he went on to form mayors for a guaranteed income. Now we've seen pilots across the country, and like I mentioned, including in Arlington County and Fairfax County and Alexandria City and Richmond City. And so I think that's a very specific example of local governments being responsive, being open and transparent, providing very clear transparency that we don't have an unlimited amount of money, but we also recognize that all these different programs and initiatives they have, they're doing a bit of work to support our residents, to support our communities. But what people really need are direct cash payments, recurring payments, right? And so I think that's a very specific example. The second example that I'll give, and that's something that, again, we see in Arlington, Alexandria, a number of localities, Fairfax County, a number of localities across the Commonwealth, and that's really intentionally advancing equity. Right. And so, and I say that as someone serving as a chief equity officer, I think what we have tried to do is we are getting to a point where we are trying to ensure that equity is baked in and it's not just the icing on top of the cake. Right. And so that requires not only identifying those chief equity or racial equity or diversity officers, that's also ensuring that they have funding behind the work that they're doing, that with that there comes along racial equity strategic plans and equity action plans that actually have direct implications. There's mandated training for staff or employees that are working in local government. And then whatever efforts you have, the public can transparently see your progress towards those efforts. Public and community shouldn't have to search for the information, right? It should be readily available. One of the things that we were able to do at the state level, once we stood up the statewide Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, first ever office stood up of its kind in the nation, and this took place under Governor Northam's administration, we were actually able to establish an equity dashboard So we weren't just talking the talk, right? We were actually showing you what we were doing very openly and transparently. And so I think it's a combination of, leveraging that technology, putting people in the right places, and then very specific policy initiatives as well. And so the transparency, the accountability.
Awesome. And, I definitely want to dive in for one quick follow-up question on that. How do you deal with, particularly we're living in the interesting times in America particularly where they're trying to defund, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. We're living in times where people are trying to take away basic core Social Security protections in our country. So with the universal income, and you're also thinking about, how you were able to navigate getting the first ever DE&I program done at the statewide level and having that dashboard. I guess, what are some of the things that you would do to encourage your peers throughout the rest of the country, how Virginia has led and of course continues to be a leader in that space, but also keeping in mind that those same protections are also under attack in Virginia right now as well. But so what are some of the things that we can do to kind of try to get the ship right back on course?
Yeah, I like that.
Well.
I like that. So how do we right the ship, right?
Yeah.
It's going to take a lot, right? And so I think we have an administration currently at the state level, right, that is trying to rebrand and reimagine what it is. It is not diversity, opportunity, and inclusion. It is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it is, in fact, not dead. It is very much alive and thriving. And the work has to continue. I do think that there is so much fear and misunderstanding around what it is. DEI has been around for decades, right? You look at Verna Myers, that's Chief Diversity Officer, right, with Netflix. She's a perfect example of someone that's been doing this work for a very long time. So the work has been here and it's been done. It's now causing a little bit more discomfort, right? But I do think that we have to, even amongst this group, right, where we are amongst family, right, we still have biases that we need to address and confront. And so I think number one is getting comfortable with the discomfort and recognizing that in this work, in this space, that it's a journey, right? You don't participate or sit through one training. You don't get a diversity, equity, and inclusion certificate, and then your learning journey is complete. You don't just read The Color of Law or Evicted or Poverty by Matthew Desmond and you're done, right? It's what's the follow-up, right? How do you actually leverage and use the information that you're getting to actually advance good? And then I think it's also, when I approach the work, I try to just try to make it digestible, right? It can be a bit intimidating if it's a space that you're not as comfortable with. Some of us may not be as familiar with some of the challenges that are experienced by the disability community, for example, right? And so when you consider those various dimensions of diversity, that's included. I am from Southern Virginia, okay, South side of Virginia, Danville on the North Carolina border. And so my experience as being someone that's Black, someone that is Black from a rural area, a Black woman from a more rural area, that was the last capital of the Confederacy. My experience is going to be a little bit different from perhaps someone else in another part of the state. It doesn't minimize their experience nor mine. Right. And so it's an acknowledgement of all of those differences. But very practically, in this moment, when we see this work under attack, I think we continue to push back and we continue to emphasize the importance of it and the necessity of it. And I think it's just that simple, right? We just continue to push and push, and we can't let the naysayers win because the work is too critical and we've come too far to turn back.
Awesome. Just powerful and really inspired by the work that you've been doing as well. Thank you for that. Michael, how can our community get more involved? And and also not just getting involved, but having the ability to begin influencing decision-making, particularly here at the local level as well?
That's a great question. And before I answer that, I just dropped a link in the chat. I love the dialogue that you and Traci were having. Just about how can we get involved, right? Benjamin Crump, was awarded the Civil Rights Activist Award at the Image Awards this year. I want to encourage everyone after this call to take a look at his remarks. It's only 5 minutes, but it's really encouraging, and he talks a lot about some of those things that are under fire. And then the second thing that I thought was so important that I just want to lift up as well, at the NAACP, we're charged with agitating, disrupting, getting under folks' skin, because we know that causes conversations to happen. And so we talked a little bit about discomfort, and I'm a big believer that true growth happens with discomfort. And so the fact that we're seeing so much pushback, so many people trying to change the narrative in education and history, that tells us without a shadow of a doubt that we're on the right path. So now to answer your question, the first thing that comes to mind for me is a movie from Will Smith, and he's talking to his son. And I can't remember the name of the movie, but he's looking at him and he says, "Don't ever let anyone tell you that you can't do something." And that's what I want to tell all of us tonight is, we all have different strengths. We all have different abilities. And so when it comes to getting involved, leverage something that you're already passionate about, and you would be surprised at the difference that you can make. I believe that we can't change the world with one person, but one person can change a world. And if enough people changed a world, then the world will change itself. And so never underestimate the power that's already within you. You're standing on the shoulders of giants. You're walking in the footsteps of leaders that have come before you. And again, we all have strengths and passions. Leverage those strengths, leverage those passions to make a difference in your community.
Awesome. I love that. Leverage those strengths, leverage those passions. I totally and wholeheartedly agree with that as well. Thank you for that. Traci, what are some of the potential consequences of apathy or disinterest in local or statewide elections? And why is it important for folks to stay engaged?
Yeah, I think we're seeing it right now.
Yeah.
We're seeing it play out right now. Yeah. Right. I get so frustrated when people say, "Oh, well, that doesn't matter. Why would I vote? No one cares, who I vote for, and it's not going to change anything anyway." How often have we heard that? Mm-hmm. And I would argue and push back, right? And so I would argue and say, what voting did? Voting expanded Medicaid in the Commonwealth of Virginia and closed a gap for literally hundreds of thousands of Virginians, right? Voting, re-enfranchised more than 300,000 individuals, giving them the right to vote back, right, after they'd served their time. Voting pardoned nearly 2,000 people. It matters. It matters. It allowed us to create a statewide African-American advisory board to ensure that there was a dedicated focus on the Black community, right, and that voices of Black residents, Virginians, were elevated to the governor's administration. The same thing, it allowed us to create a statewide LGBTQ advisory board. And so voting absolutely matters. You can look outside and look at any city. Taking Arlington, for example, look at what's happening with all of the development in the area. Now, there can be arguments made to the progress of that development, certainly arguments made about whether enough supports will be in place for housing, and I recognize and certainly acknowledge the challenges there. But because of those decisions, because of voting, again, a campus is coming to the area, jobs are being generated, new educational opportunities are made available there through Virginia Tech's Innovation Campus. And again, all of that is because of voting. I can run the list. African-American history standards were updated and then they were changed in the Commonwealth of Virginia, right, because of voting. And so it's all interconnected and it all matters. And so you can't take a single election for granted because your livelihood, our livelihood, is on the line.
Yeah. Wow. And then that's so powerful, particularly with the history, when you mentioned that the standards have been changed and they've been updated. And that is actually something that we have to fight against. So I definitely appreciate you sharing that. And our elections have consequences. And we're seeing that here in Virginia now.
Can I give you a bit of context to that in particular, to George?
Yeah.
So under the Northam administration, we established the African American History Education Commission. commission was very thoroughly thought out. The group of individuals that were serving included individuals that were in a K-12 education, higher ed, individuals that were parents, right? There was representation from the NAACP, community leaders and advocates. We engaged students, right? And so it was a very well thought out process. It was an extended process to ensure we were getting to a place of telling a more accurate and comprehensive history, right? And with one election, right? We are now winding the clock back, right? And what an unfortunate time, right? I mean, it was such a beautiful opportunity to come through 2019, right? And move into 2020 and what we saw with the pandemic, and we see racial unrest. Well, guess what? Virginia was positioned and had done the work to tell that accurate and comprehensive history, right? We had celebrated in 2019 in recognizing the anniversary of 1619 and the arrival of the first enslaved Africans. And so what a beautiful opportunity to continue moving our Commonwealth forward, right? We established that Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. We established what a lot of people don't know was our Racial Equity Commission. And internally, we called it the Jim Crow Commission. This was another group that actually looked at language that was still on Virginia's books, is what we call them, but essentially still in the code of Virginia that was discriminatory. And we worked to roll that back, right? What a beautiful opportunity. And again, one election changed that.
Wow, it's so powerful. Elections have consequences. Yeah, definitely. Michael, coming back to you, what are some of the ways that local governments can work together with the community members to address common challenges and achieve shared goals? And the goal there was really to kind of focus on, how can the government really help, particularly partnering with the NAACP to tackle some of those shared goals?
Great question. And if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. That's really all I could say. And, one way that governments can really work together are some of these commissions that you've heard about. There are commissions at the statewide level. There are commissions at the local level. There are commissions even at the neighborhood level in your civic association. So, whatever capacity you have, you can get involved. You can have a seat at the table. You have a voice at the table. In the metropolitan region, we have the Council of Government that really, tries to work together to move the entire region forward. Things like free buses are coming out of that, right? So, Alexandria, DC, Arlington soon will all have free buses. We subsidize our buses so much that it doesn't really make sense to even be charging the little bit of money that we're charging because it doesn't cover anything, right? It makes a lot more sense for us to just make the buses free. We're going to see positive impacts on environmental, climate, and justice. We're going to see less people using their cars, which is, again, contributing to our future society. So, I'd say there's a lot of different ways that the government can work together, but unless you're at the table, unless you have a voice, then you're going to be on the menu. So never be afraid to just jump in. Even if it's at the neighborhood level, right? We can all make a difference at the neighborhood level. When I think about President Barack Obama, went from being a community organizer, organizing 3 or 4 people when he first started, to becoming the president of the United States. So start where you are, use what you have, and make a difference in your local community.
That's so powerful. If you're not at the meeting, then you're on the menu. And I think that is a really powerful statement. Thank you for sharing that. So we've come to the last question. So I would love you both to answer this question, the prepared questions. After that, we'll open it up to the attendees to be able to ask some questions, and we can take a few as time permits. But for our last question, we'd love you both to answer. How can local elections help to build stronger and more resilient communities? And why is it important to our future? And Traci, did you want to kick us off with that?
Sure, I was processing. And so, how
I can repeat it one more time too. I can repeat it.
Yeah, how can local elections help get more people engaged, essentially, right in the process?
And why is it so important to our future?
Yeah. I think that, so when I think about voter engagement kind of generally, right? And I'll bring it full circle to local elections. I think about those, it's different phases, right? I think it's the initial registration phase, right? So you need to get registered, number one, first and foremost. I'm sure everyone here is registered, and I know that your information is updated if you've relocated, right? Let's just check that box while we're here. The next phase, right? I think it's education, right? And so you need to know that you can vote up to 45 days before the election, or that you can become a permanent, absentee voter, right? And so it's educating yourself, educating your neighbors, those in your household, those that you may, just interact with socially, right? So I think that's another really important phase. And then I think the third phase is the mobilization, right? And that's actually getting people out to the polls. From an accessibility standpoint, just removing any sort of physical barriers. And so whether that's coordinating with free transportation, I know the NAACP does souls to the polls. I know within my sorority and other groups, we stroll to the polls, we soar to the polls, right? However we need to get there, we get there, right? And so I think those are all important phases. But I think local government plays such an important role, right? And I view it as local government, for me, is the campaign that never ends, right? One of my biggest challenges with many elected officials, right? And so you run on a platform, you're elected, and your engagement stops, right? But it should never stop. You should use those same tactics, those same strategies, those mailers, that door knocking, that canvassing, that phone baking. You should continuously be getting the word out about the incredible work that's happening, and also use it as a feedback loop so that you can hear where there are gaps in services and opportunities to be even better. And so I think it's so important at the local level, because quite frankly, here with our local elected officials, you can run into them at the grocery store, right? Yeah. You can run into them at the gas station, because they live here in the same communities that they're elected in. And so it's a little less distance between them. And so I think it's especially critical, but I think that the election should never stop, right? The campaigning should never stop. And it becomes a continuous feedback loop. And I think then you build that momentum, you build that muscle, and it's an excellent way to keep younger people engaged, because they see, like, wait a minute, I checked the mail and I did get that mail, or I did pull that out of the mailbox and I saw that it came from the mayor or a council member, right? I didn't know what the issue was they were talking about, but at least they're starting to see that, again, continuous engagement.
Awesome. Thank you. And Mike?
Yeah, I mean, Traci, you kind of hit everything out of the park. I'm having to think real creatively on things that we can do. From my perspective, I think that we have two main political parties in this country, which kind of works to our detriment sometimes, because sometimes you agree with maybe a little bit of what this political party is doing, and maybe you agree with like most of what this political party is doing, but not everything. But you're forced to choose between one of the two. Those two political parties, when they're getting out the vote and they're trying to find out who their voters are, there is an enormous amount of data on every single one of us. You'd be surprised. These two political parties, they go out into voters where they know are going to vote no matter what. They are going to be at the polls no matter what. And then they go after voters that they know are going to be reliably in their party. What ends up happening is these two political parties end up talking to the same people over and over and over, and the voting base actually gets smaller. So then the ideas that we're bringing to the local elections, again, they're coming from one very small, likely affluent or privileged community. And those viewpoints aren't really reflective of what's going on in the entire community. The next thing I think that we should change is our local politicians are not paid well, and they're not paid well on purpose, because they don't want folks like you and I to be able to run. Historically in Virginia, when you think about a state delegate or state representative or state senator getting paid $17,000, $18,000 a year, that is ridiculous, right? No one can quit their job and go become an elected official and live off of $18,000, but you know who can? Lobbyists can, affluent people can, people that have generational wealth or trust funds. these people have access to capital. They're not worried about that $18,000 or $20,000. And unfortunately, when those folks end up getting elected, again, they don't typically bring the viewpoint of the entire community with them. And so I know we talked a little bit about apathy, but it's almost like this vicious cycle of folks are like, you know what? No party really represents me, or when I elect this party, nothing really changes in my community. Again, it really goes back to us being the change that we want to seek. We have to be the leaders that we're waiting for. We have to jump in no matter what level it is, even if it's your block, your neighborhood, your civic association, whatever you feel comfortable with, your leadership influence and your leadership impact will grow.
Awesome. And with that, Brother Conyers, did you want to read out some of the questions from the chat?
Yes, thank you, Brother Griffin. Traci and Mike, such a dynamic discussion, so many insights that our attendees can take away. I'm really inspired and impressed by both of you. So the first question is really around the topic of gerrymandering. So based on our country's extremely polarized political environment, really aggressive chicanery, are there ways that as an individual we can combat gerrymandering within local elections? There are many jurisdictions across Virginia where folks feel like this is really an issue, right? And their vote doesn't matter locally, but perhaps more so nationally. So in addition to voting, like we certainly understand that's sort of like a threshold, a standard here. What else can the community do? And either of you, maybe both of you could provide your perspectives.
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in. It goes back to something Michael said earlier. And when he mentioned board service, I think is critically important. Virginia had a redistricting commission, right? There was certainly opportunity for individuals to lean in there. But even before you get to actually leaning into an effort like that, I think it's education, right? So really, when you hear the word gerrymandering, I think taking a bit of time to fully understand how your district was drawn, right? And whether that was at the local level, the state level. And they could be two different things. And so I think first and foremost, it's just familiarizing yourself with the process and understanding what the process is. What's the cycle by which the process is revisited, right? And so I think all of those things are important. And then looking for those opportunities to lean in and serve. So whether that's, pursuing an opportunity like serving on the statewide Virginia Redistricting Commission or serving at the local level, localities often, will undergo different efforts where they may look at their charter, for example, and that's certainly an opportunity to start to get your foot in the door, a little different from redistricting, but a good opportunity for you to start to understand the larger process, right? And so I think that's another really good way to lean in. And then ultimately, you can just keep showing up. So whether that's to your Board of Supervisors meetings, your city council, town council meetings, just show up and ask the questions. You don't have to come with all the answers, but that's exactly what constituent services is for, and that's what staff is for, right? And so email your questions, show up to your council members or your Board of Supervisors members. They should have a district meeting at some point that should be held on a regular basis, right? Sign up and subscribe to follow them across social media, sign up for their newsletter, get in front of them and ask the questions. Even if you don't have a full understanding of the issue, just keep pushing, keep pressing, keep asking. And I guarantee you, they'll know who you are. They will know it's an issue of concern. And then maybe the next time you show up with 2 more people, and then a few more, and just keep on pushing.
Wow, I love that. I love that. Mike, anything else that you'd like to add?
Yeah, it really just goes back to make sure that you vote. When we don't vote, we do not get the leaders that have our best interest at stake. And what ends up happening is instead of us electing who we want in that office, elected leaders end up drawing their own districts and picking who their voters are. We also need to repass the Voting Rights Act. Time and time again, the Supreme Court has struck down states' districts because they are just straight up racist and unconstitutional. Time and time again. And what that law did was it required states that had a history of gerrymandering their districts to go before the Supreme Court to make sure that those states were balanced, that they were contiguous, that they were fair. And now those states don't have to do that. And so we talked about rolling back the clock, and that's exactly what's happening right now is our elected officials are drawing the maps that they want. They're drawing the maps where they know they have favorable voters, and they're concentrating the voters that don't look like them or have a different viewpoint all into the same district. Or in Virginia recently, one of our congressional districts hopped over mountains and across rivers and was not even together. So the most foundational and fundamental thing that you can do is vote, because when you don't, you become a data point for potentially being drawn into another district. And if they know that you're going to vote, it's harder for them to break up your community.
Wow. Both very powerful insights. Voting, education, awareness, right? So that you can be empowered and informed to affect changing in your community so it doesn't happen to you. So the next question is around accessibility. So what are the barriers, So what are the barriers with making a greater effort to give people more access to vote via mail-in vote? So recognizing perhaps that, certain folks can't get out of their homes, there could be sort of disability accessibility challenges, right? Maybe across different jurisdictions, mail-in voting isn't an option. So again, what are perhaps a better question might be some solutions to mitigate accessibility challenges to allow for more mail-in votes? And Mike, maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, definitely. I think one, we got to modernize our voting system, right? We have generations that are growing up that get phones at the age of, 5, 6, 7, but then they're required to go into a place and actually cast their vote, right? Yes, that's our foundational responsibility as a U.S. citizen, but I think there are things that we can do to modernize the way that we vote. I also think getting rid of the witness requirement. Right now, you can become a permanent absentee voter, but you also have you need to have somebody witness you signing that ballot. And then also in the same way that we dump money into these public relations firms to, help with other stuff to steer public opinion, I think that, we could dump money into voting by mail to get the word out. Most folks that I talk to that say, I'm not going to vote because I work, 12 hours and the polls are not even open from the time that, I'm getting off the bus or on my way to work. So I think that we can fund vote by mail more and get the word out.
Thank you for that. I'm going to try to move us ahead because I certainly want to give George opportunity for a couple of closing remarks and want to be timely. The last question I think is actually a really good one as we think about future voters, right, in the pipeline and beginning to expose young children, about the importance, perhaps like for myself, I take my daughter and my son to the poll with me, and certainly make sure that they're accessing this forum and platform. So what are some other sort of best practices that you might suggest to encourage elementary age kids about the power of voting, and certainly in an age appropriate manner? Maybe Traci, I'll let you have that one.
Yeah, I love that, and love that you're taking your children. I think that's so important. And so take your children, take your nieces and nephews and the younger, just all the younger people in your life to see that, right? But I think another part of that is engaging them in the process that you took to get to that point, right? How did you make your decision on who you're going to vote for? And so my godson, who I think is exceptionally brilliant, he reached out to me a few years ago and he goes, Traci, and I was like, what is it, sweetie? He's like, there's going to be a delegate coming to our office and I have some questions for him. I said, oh, really? Okay, let's talk about it. And so he shared his list of questions, but I didn't talk to him as if he were a child, right? He was taking this very seriously. And so I wanted to meet him where he was and really engage him in this process and help him organize his thoughts, organize his questions so that he would be prepared to engage with his delegate, right? And so I think the more that we show what is the process to get us to that point. Did you go to the candidate's website, for example? Did you attend a fundraiser or another event? And why not take them along to those events as well? Why not show them the website, call out some of the issues that matter and some things that they may be able to relate to? So for example, if you have a candidate that's running on an education platform, right? A candidate that's running around sustainability or environmental justice, and they want to create more green spaces, talk to your children about what that means for them. Perhaps that's more playgrounds, right? And so that's just something to consider. And then finally, the other side of it is show them the good stuff that happens when the right people are in office, right? And so whether it's a grand opening, like that economic development deal that we talked about earlier, and it's something that speaks to them, or a small ice cream shop, right? A locally owned ice cream shop in the area, take them and help make the connection and say, you know how this was opened? Well, you remember that person that mommy or daddy voted for? Well, guess what? This was a big priority for them. And look, it happened because remember, we went and we cast that ballot, and now we have this great ice cream shop in our area. So find ways to make the connection, meeting them where they are.
I love that. I love it. Wow. You're awesome, Traci. So with that, that's going to conclude our question and answer portion. I want to turn it over to Brother Griffin to offer any last remarks or key highlights.
Yeah, so one of the things we always like to encourage is every voter, every election. Voting is what gives you your power. So we always are encouraging you to vote. With that, there are some key upcoming dates here in Virginia that are important and we want you to remember. The voter registration deadline is next Tuesday, May 30th, for new voters or to update your existing voter information. Again, that's Tuesday, May 30th, 1 week from today. So I wanted to make sure that you get a chance to get out there and get registered. Or if you don't know anyone else, or to encourage your friends, family, relatives, please let people know to register to vote. Additionally, the mail-in ballot request deadline is Friday, June 9th. So again, making sure that if you want to vote by mail, you have to make sure your request is in by Friday, June 9th. In-person voting in Virginia begins on Saturday, June 10th, and the last day to vote in-person early voting is June 17th. The Virginia primary election will be on Tuesday, June 20th, and the general election is on Tuesday, November 7th, later this year. With that, I would like to once again thank our distinguished, brilliant, and absolutely amazing panelists, the Honorable Traci Deshazor, and brother, as well as friend and colleague, President Michael Hemminger as well. So thank you all for this wonderful evening. Thank you all for everything that you're continuing to do in our community. And thank you all attendees for coming. And with that, wishing everyone a wonderful evening. Take care.